It was just another busy Tuesday at LAX. The airport buzzed with travelers rushing to catch flights, dragging suitcases behind them while balancing coffee cups and phone calls. Among them was Gabrielle Union, walking with her head slightly down, a baseball cap pulled low over her eyes. She wasn't trying to be recognized today. Gabrielle had just wrapped up 3 exhausting weeks of filming. All she wanted now was to get back to New York, take a long bath, and sleep in her own bed. She wore comfortable clothes for the 6-hour flight, faded jeans, white sneakers, and an oversized gray hoodie that practically swallowed her slender frame. No makeup, no fuss. At the priority boarding line, she quietly showed her ticket to the gate agent, who smiled with a flash of recognition but professionally kept it to himself. "Enjoy your flight, Ms. Union," he whispered with a wink. Walking down the jet bridge, Gabrielle felt her phone buzz. Her agent had texted about a potential new role, something she'd look at later when she had the energy. Right now, she just wanted peace. The first-class cabin was half empty when she boarded. Gabrielle found her window seat, 3A, tucked her small backpack under the seat in front, and settled in. She pulled out her noise-canceling headphones and a dog-eared copy of a Toni Morrison novel she'd been trying to finish for months. Just as the calm feeling of having an empty seat beside her started to sink in, commotion erupted at the front of the cabin. A woman's sharp voice cut through the quiet. "Careful with those. They're worth more than you make in a year." Heads turned toward the source of the disruption. There stood Eleanor Harrington, a woman in her 50s with expensive blonde highlights and jewelry that caught the light with every dramatic gesture of her hands. She directed the flight attendant, who struggled with 3 designer bags, each appearing heavier than the last. "That goes in the overhead, not there. Are you new? Where is your supervisor?" Eleanor's voice carried throughout the entire cabin as she pointed to her Louis Vuitton luggage. The young flight attendant, a guy probably in his 20s with kind eyes now wide with stress, tried to calmly explain the storage limitations. Eleanor wasn't having it. Gabrielle sank deeper into her seat and raised the volume on her headphones. She'd seen this type before, people who thought their money bought them the right to treat others poorly. She exchanged glances with an older gentleman across the aisle who rolled his eyes sympathetically. Eleanor finally took her seat, 3 rows ahead of Gabrielle. Even from behind, her dissatisfaction radiated backward through the cabin. She snapped her fingers repeatedly at different flight attendants, sending one scurrying for sparkling water, not still, with lemon, not lime. As the remaining passengers filed in, Gabrielle noticed something unusual about the boarding process. The flight attendants seemed to be whispering to each other, and one kept glancing toward the front of the plane with barely contained excitement. That's when she spotted him. It was hard not to. At 7'1", Shaquille O'Neal had to duck significantly just to clear the airplane door. He moved with the practiced care of someone used to navigating a world not built for his size. A ripple of whispers spread through the cabin. A few passengers nudged each other, pointing discreetly. But most respected the unspoken celebrity code, look but don't approach. Shaq was directed to the very front row, in the private suite section separated by a partial divider. What Gabrielle didn't know then was how their paths would cross during this flight. What none of them knew was how Eleanor Harrington's behavior would soon create a situation that would leave the entire cabin speechless. As the plane began to push back from the gate, Gabrielle closed her eyes. The captain's voice came over the speaker announcing a flight time of 5 hours and 45 minutes to JFK, with expected turbulence over the Midwest. Little did anyone know that the real turbulence on this flight would have nothing to do with the weather. The plane had been in the air for about 40 minutes when the first patch of turbulence hit. It wasn't terrible, just enough to make the fasten seatbelt sign ding on with a flash. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers, his tone casual but firm. "Folks, we're hitting some rough air as expected. I'm going to ask everyone to return to their seats and keep those seatbelts fastened. Flight attendants, please pause service and secure the cabin." Gabrielle looked up from her book, marking her place with a receipt she'd found in her pocket. She'd managed to get lost in the story, briefly forgetting she was hurtling through the sky in a metal tube. The flight attendants moved quickly down the aisle, checking seatbelts and collecting half-finished drinks. 3 rows ahead, Eleanor Harrington was having none of it. She'd been working on her laptop and had several papers spread across her tray table and the empty seat beside her. When the turbulence alert came, she'd barely glanced up. "Excuse me," said a flight attendant with a practiced smile. "We need to secure all loose items. Can I help you put these away until we're through this rough patch?" Elena waved her hand dismissively. "I'm in the middle of something important. Just go around me." The plane dipped suddenly, causing several passengers to gasp. A paper slid off Elena's tray and fluttered to the floor near the aisle. The plane bumped again, harder this time, and Eleanor's expensive pen rolled under the seat in front of her. "Now look what's happened," she huffed, unbuckling her seatbelt despite the illuminated sign. As she bent to reach for the pen, another jolt of turbulence sent her stumbling sideways. She caught herself on the headrest, but looked genuinely rattled. The flight attendant who had tried to help her was now at the front of the cabin, securing the galley. Elena's gaze darted around, looking for someone to assist her. That's when she spotted Gabrielle in her casual hoodie, headphones now around her neck. "You?" Elena snapped her fingers loudly, pointing directly at Gabrielle. "Come help me pick up my things." The entire first-class cabin seemed to freeze. A businessman lowered his newspaper. An older woman with pearl earrings turned to stare. Gabrielle looked up, confused, glancing around to see who Elena was addressing. "Yes, you in the gray hoodie," Eleanor continued, her voice sharp and entitled. "Make yourself useful and help me gather my papers before they blow everywhere." Understanding dawned on Gabrielle's face. This woman thought she was a flight attendant. She took a breath, keeping her expression neutral. "I'm sorry, but I'm not a flight attendant," Gabrielle replied calmly. "I'm a passenger, just like you." Elena squinted at her, disbelief crossing her features. "A passenger? In first class?" She looked Gabrielle up and down, taking in the casual clothes and minimal makeup. "Yes," Gabrielle said simply, maintaining her composure. "A passenger in first class." Elena gave a short, dismissive laugh. "Well, you certainly don't look like you belong here." She turned to the man across the aisle from her. "Can you believe they let just anyone in first class these days?" The man looked uncomfortable and pretended to be deeply interested in the safety card from the seat pocket. "I paid for my seat, just like everyone else," Gabrielle responded, her voice still calm though her knuckles had whitened around her book. "Did you, though?" Elena's voice dripped with condescension. "Or did someone buy it for you? A boyfriend, perhaps? Or did you use points from some credit card promotion they're giving to just anyone these days?" A few passengers shifted uncomfortably. The flight attendant who had returned to the cabin opened her mouth to intervene, but Eleanor continued. "If you're going to sit in first class, you should at least make an effort to dress appropriately. That hoodie looks like something my gardener would wear." Gabrielle sat up straighter, something hardening in her eyes though her voice remained level. "I wasn't aware first class had a dress code. I thought it was about the ticket, not the outfit." Clearly, Eleanor sniffed, gathering the last of her papers herself. "Some of us work hard for the privilege of flying first class. It used to mean something." The plane hit another pocket of turbulence, and the seatbelt sign dinged insistently. The flight attendant finally stepped forward. "Ma'am, I need you to return to your seat and fasten your seatbelt immediately." Elena complied reluctantly, shooting one last disdainful look at Gabrielle. The cabin hummed with uncomfortable tension. No one spoke, but several passengers exchanged glances. A woman across from Gabrielle gave her a small smile of solidarity. Little did anyone know that the situation was about to take an unexpected turn. In the lavatory at the front of the plane, someone had heard the entire exchange through the thin door. Someone whose presence would change everything. The turbulence had settled, but the tension in the first-class cabin had not. Gabrielle tried to return to her book, but the words swam in front of her eyes. She could feel curious glances from other passengers, some sympathetic, others just nosy. It was hard to disappear into a story when you'd just been put on display. A flight attendant stopped by her seat, leaning down to whisper, "I'm so sorry about that. Can I get you anything?" Gabrielle shook her head with a small smile. "I'm fine, thanks." But Elena wasn't done. Having safely buckled back into her seat, she was now loudly discussing the declining standards of first-class travel with anyone in Urshut. Most passengers responded with polite nods or uncomfortable smiles, trying to disengage without being rude. It used to be that first class meant something, Eleanor said, loud enough for the entire cabin to hear. People dressed properly. They understood etiquette. Now look around. She made a sweeping gesture that not so subtly included Gabrielle in its path. An older gentleman with silver hair and kind eyes caught Gabrielle's glance and rolled his eyes slightly, as if to say, just ignore her. The flight attendants began drink service again, working their way through the cabin with practiced efficiency. When they reached Eleanor, she made a production of ordering a champagne, specifying the brand and year, though the airline only carried one option. And make sure the glass is properly chilled, she added, as if instructing someone who had never served a drink before. The attendant, a woman with short dark hair and impressive patience, simply smiled and said, "Of course." When the same attendant reached Gabrielle's row, Eleanor turned in her seat to watch the interaction. "Just water, please," Gabrielle said quietly. "Tap water, I assume." Eleanor called out, "It suits the outfit." The flight attendant's smile tightened. She handed Gabrielle a bottle of sparkling water with a napkin and whispered, "On the house." Eleanor wasn't deterred. "You know," she said, now addressing her seatmate but speaking loudly enough for Rose around to hear, "I once sponsored a charity event where we helped underprivileged youth learn how to dress for success. Perhaps we should have handed out pamphlets on airline travel etiquette too." Gabrielle took a slow sip of her water. She'd dealt with people like Eleanor before. Sometimes it was best to let them talk themselves into a hole. The woman clearly wanted a reaction, wanted to feel important by putting someone else down. A few seats away, a young woman who recognized Gabrielle was recording the incident discreetly with her phone, partially hidden behind the in-flight magazine. Eleanor, oblivious to being documented, continued her performance. "When I pay for first class, I expect a certain environment," she announced to no one in particular. "Not to be seated near people who look like they wandered in from the street." The businessman across from Eleanor finally spoke up, though his voice was gentle rather than confrontational. "Ma'am, maybe we should all just enjoy the flight quietly." Eleanor turned on him immediately. "I'm sorry, am I disturbing your precious peace? When standards fall, someone needs to speak up." The man retreated behind his newspaper again. Gabrielle closed her book slowly and took a deep breath. She had two choices: continue ignoring this woman or stand up for herself. The cabin felt like a theater now, with everyone watching to see what would happen next. "Excuse me," Gabrielle said, her voice carrying clearly despite its softness. "I couldn't help overhearing your concerns about first-class standards." Eleanor turned, surprised that her target was engaging. "Well, at least you're listening to someone with experience." "I fly first class regularly," Gabrielle continued calmly. "And in my experience, the true mark of class has never been about what you wear or how much money you have." Eleanor's eyes narrowed. "Of course someone dressed like you would say that." "True class," Gabrielle continued as if she hadn't been interrupted, "is about how you treat people. All people." A few passengers nodded in agreement. Someone near the back of the cabin started to clap but stopped when a flight attendant shot them a warning look. Eleanor's face flushed red. Being challenged publicly was clearly not something she was used to. "How dare you lecture me about class? Do you have any idea who I am? My family has been flying private jets since before you were born. The only reason I'm on a commercial flight today is because our jet is being serviced." As Eleanor's voice rose, the flight attendants exchanged worried glances. The head attendant began moving toward the confrontation, prepared to intervene if things escalated further. Just then, the lavatory door at the front of the cabin opened. A massive figure ducked to clear the doorframe, causing several passengers to gasp. The timing couldn't have been more perfect or more dramatic. The lavatory door swung open, and it seemed like the entire cabin held its breath at once. Shaquille O'Neal ducked his head as he stepped out, his massive frame making the airplane look even smaller than it was. At 7'1", he had to hunch slightly to avoid hitting the ceiling. A few passengers gasped. Someone whispered, "Is that who I think it is?" Shaq paused, taking in the scene before him. His eyes moved from the red-faced Eleanor to Gabrielle, who sat with her back straight and her expression calm despite the tension radiating through the cabin. In the brief silence that followed, you could practically hear people's minds racing as they processed what was happening. Elena hadn't noticed Shaq yet. She was too busy continuing her tirade, her voice getting shriller with each word. "I don't care what you think about class. The fact is, standards exist for a reason, and some people clearly don't belong in certain spaces." Shaq's eyebrows rose slightly. He glanced at the flight attendant nearby, who looked both stressed and relieved at his appearance, like she'd been hoping for divine intervention and got a basketball legend instead. "Excuse me," Shaq said, his deep voice immediately commanding attention. The simple phrase echoed through the cabin, and heads whipped around to find its source. Eleanor turned, her next complaint dying on her lips as she looked up, and up, and up. "Oh my," she said, her tone shifting instantly from aggressive to saccharine sweet. "Shaquille O'Neal, what an unexpected pleasure." Shaq didn't return her smile. Instead, he moved down the aisle with surprising grace for a man his size. He stopped when he reached Gabrielle's row. "Gabby, I thought that was you." Gabrielle's face broke into a genuine smile. "Shaq, I didn't know you were on this flight." "I'm heading to New York for that charity thing on Thursday," he said, then lowered his voice though most people could still hear him. "Was gonna sleep the whole way, but man, it's hard to rest when someone's voice keeps cutting through those noise-canceling headphones, you know." A few passengers chuckled. Elena's face flushed even deeper. Shaq extended his hand to Gabrielle, and when she took it, her hand practically disappeared in his massive palm. "How's Dwayne and the family?" he asked, referring to Gabrielle's husband, former NBA star Dwayne Wade. "They're great," Gabrielle replied. "Dee's gonna meet me in New York tomorrow." Elena watched this exchange with growing discomfort, her eyes darting between the two celebrities as realization slowly dawned on her face. The woman she had been insulting and dismissing wasn't just another passenger. She was Gabrielle Union, a successful actress married to an NBA legend and apparently friends with Shaquille O'Neal. "You two know each other?" Eleanor asked, her voice now strained with forced politeness. Shaq turned to look at her, his expression friendly but with a hint of steel behind his eyes. "Know each other? Me and Gabby go way back. One of the most talented actresses in Hollywood right here." He gestured toward Gabrielle with obvious respect. "But you already knew that, right?" Elena's mouth opened and closed several times without words coming out. The other passengers watched with barely concealed fascination. It was like witnessing a train wreck in slow motion, impossible to look away from. I didn't recognize." Elena stumbled over her words. "Really?" Shaq's tone was conversational, but there was something pointed about it. "Gabrielle's been in dozens of hit movies. Cover of magazines too. Strange you wouldn't recognize her." A young man in the second row couldn't contain himself any longer. "Bring it on. Bad boys. She was amazing in Think Like a Man." Gabrielle gave a small, humble wave of acknowledgement. "I don't watch many films," Elena said weakly. "That's cool," Shaq said with a shrug. "But you know what's not cool? Judging people based on what they're wearing, especially when you don't know who they are." Elena's face went from red to white. The cabin had gone so quiet you could hear the hum of the engines more clearly than before. "I wasn't judging," Eleanor began, but Shaq raised one enormous hand. "I heard everything from the bathroom," he said simply. "Walls on planes are thin." A flight attendant approached cautiously. "Mr. O'Neal, would you like to return to your seat? We're expecting a bit more turbulence soon." Shaq nodded but didn't move immediately. He looked down at Gabrielle. "You good here?" Gabrielle nodded, a small smile playing at her lips. "I'm fine, but thanks for checking." "Anytime." Shaq turned to head back to his seat, but paused as he passed Eleanor's row. He bent down slightly, not in an intimidating way, but simply to be closer to her eye level. "You know," he said quietly, though in the silent cabin his words carried, "the thing about first class is that it's just a section on a plane. Real class?" He gestured toward Gabrielle. "That's something else entirely." With that, he continued to his seat, ducking his head carefully under the overhead bins. The stunned silence that followed felt like it might stretch on forever. The silence lasted only a few seconds, but it felt like an eternity. Elena sat frozen in her seat, her face a mix of embarrassment and shock. The other passengers were equally still, as if nobody wanted to be the first to break the spell that Shaq's words had cast over the cabin. Finally, a flight attendant cleared her throat and continued with the drink service, her movements deliberately casual, trying to restore normality to the tense atmosphere. The soft clink of ice in glasses and the rustle of napkins being handed out created a gentle background noise that helped ease the tension slightly. But the damage was done. Elena's public humiliation hung in the air like a storm cloud. Several passengers were now openly looking at Gabrielle with newfound recognition and respect. A woman 2 rows back was quietly explaining to her seatmate who Gabrielle Union was, listing her film credits in an excited whisper. Gabrielle took a sip of her water and returned took a book, or at least pretended to. The slight tremble in her hands was the only sign that the confrontation had affected her. Years in Hollywood had taught her how to maintain her composure in difficult situations, but being publicly degraded was never easy, no matter how many times you experienced it. Shaq had returned to his seat in the front row, but his presence was still felt throughout the cabin. Every few minutes he would turn slightly, his large frame visible as he checked on Gabrielle. The simple gesture spoke volumes. He was keeping watch, making sure she was okay. Elena sat rigidly in her seat, staring straight ahead. The businessman beside her had shifted as far away as his seat would allow, creating a small but noticeable gap between them. No one wanted to be associated with her behavior now. About 20 minutes passed this way, with the cabin in an uncomfortable limbo. Then, to everyone's surprise, Shaq stood up again. He spoke briefly to a flight attendant who nodded, and then he made his way back down the aisle. This time, he stopped directly beside Elena's seat. "Mind if I sit here for a minute?" he asked, gesturing to the empty aisle seat next to her. Eleanor looked startled but nodded quickly. Of course, she stammered. Shaq carefully lowered himself into the seat, which seemed comically small for his frame. He turned toward Eleanor, his expression not unkind but serious. "You know," he began, his deep voice quiet enough that only those in the immediate vicinity could hear, "I've been thinking about what happened earlier." Eleanor swallowed hard. "Mr. O'Neill, I assure you." Shaq held up a hand. "Please call me Shaq. Everybody does." His tone was friendly, but there was no mistaking the seriousness in his eyes. "Here's the thing. We all make mistakes. Lord knows I've made plenty. The question is what we do after." Elena glanced around nervously, aware that several passengers were watching this exchange with undisguised interest. "I'm not here to make you feel worse," Shaq continued. "That's not my style. But I think you and I both know that how you spoke to Gabrielle wasn't right. Not because she's famous, that doesn't matter. It wouldn't be right to speak to anyone that way." Elena's shoulders slumped slightly. For the first time since boarding, she looked smaller somehow, less imposing. I didn't realize who she was," she said weakly. "That's kind of my point," Shaq replied gently. "None of us know everyone's story when we first meet them. That's why treating everyone with respect matters so much." A few rows back, Gabrielle was watching this exchange. She couldn't hear the words, but she could see the body language, the way Shaq was speaking earnestly, and the way Eleanor was actually listening. "In my career," Shaq continued, "I've met people from all walks of life. Billionaires, janitors, presidents, teachers. You know what I learned? The size of someone's wallet or the clothes they wear tell you nothing about the size of their heart or their worth as a person." Eleanor nodded slowly, her eyes downcast. "Now, I'm not telling you what to do next," Shaq said, beginning to rise from the seat with careful movements. "That's for you to decide. But I believe that when we know better, we do better." As he stood, towering in the aisle, he added one more thing, and just between us, Gabrielle Union is not only one of the most successful actresses in Hollywood, but she's also one of the kindest people I know. That hoodie she's wearing, it's probably designer and costs more than my first car. He winked, taking some of the sting out of his words. Eleanor's eyes widened slightly at this revelation. Shaq began making his way back toward his seat, stopping briefly at Gabrielle's row. He bent down and whispered something in her ear that made her smile and nod. Then he continued to his seat, leaving behind a cabin full of passengers who had just witnessed a masterclass in handling conflict with grace. The ball was now in Eleanor's court. Everyone watched, waiting to see what she would do next. Eleanor sat stiffly in her seat for a long time after Shaq left. She stared out the window, watching clouds drift by as if they might offer some escape from the situation she'd created. The businessman next to her had put on headphones, clearly wanting no part in whatever might happen next. Throughout the cabin, passengers pretended to read or sleep, but their attention remained fixed on the unfolding drama. A flight attendant stopped by Eleanor's seat. "Can I get you anything, ma'am?" she asked, her tone professionally neutral. Eleanor shook her head, then changed her mind. "Actually, yes. A glass of water, please." Her voice was quieter now, the sharp edge gone. The young woman nodded and moved on. Eleanor took a deep breath and smoothed her silk blouse, a nervous habit she'd had since childhood. She glanced back toward Gabrielle's seat, where the actress was now chatting quietly with an elderly woman across the aisle who had recognized her from a movie. Eleanor watched as Gabrielle laughed at something the older woman said, her whole face lighting up with genuine warmth. There was no trace of the tension from earlier in her expression. She looked completely at ease, completely herself, hoodie and all. Something shifted in Eleanor's expression. Perhaps it was shame finally winning out over pride, or maybe it was simply the realization that she had a choice about how this story would end, as the villain or as someone who could acknowledge a mistake. When the flight attendant returned with her water, Eleanor took a small sip and then asked quietly, "Do you think? Would it be inappropriate if I went to speak with Ms. Union?" The flight attendant considered this for a moment. "I think that would be okay, as long as the seatbelt sign isn't on." Eleanor nodded, taking another sip of water to calm her nerves. She waited until the flight attendant had moved on before standing up. Several heads turned immediately. Eleanor ignored them, straightened her shoulders, and walked the few rows back to where Gabrielle was sitting. She paused in the aisle, suddenly unsure. Gabrielle looked up, her expression carefully neutral. "Ms. Union," Eleanor began, her voice unusually hesitant. "May I speak with you for a moment?" Gabrielle nodded, gesturing to the empty seat beside her. "Of course." Eleanor perched on the edge of the seat, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. The cabin had gone silent again. Everyone was watching, though pretending not to. "I owe you an apology," Eleanor said, the words coming out stiffly but clearly. "My behavior was inexcusable. I made assumptions about you based on nothing of substance, and I spoke to you in a way that was disrespectful and rude." Gabrielle's expression remained neutral, but she was listening attentively. "I'd like to say I'm not usually like this," Eleanor continued, "but that would be another lie. The truth is," she paused, seeming to struggle with her next words. "The truth is, I've probably done this many times before without anyone calling me out on it." A few rows ahead, Shaq had turned slightly in his seat, watching the interaction with quiet approval. "It shouldn't have taken someone like Mr. O'Neill to make me realize how inappropriate my behavior was," Eleanor added, her voice growing steadier as she continued. "Whether you're Gabrielle Union or anyone else, no one deserves to be treated that way." Around them, other passengers were no longer pretending not to listen. Some nodded in approval at Eleanor's words. Gabrielle was quiet for a moment, studying Eleanor's face. Then she said, "Thank you for apologizing. That can't have been easy." "It wasn't," Eleanor admitted with a small, self-deprecating smile. "But it was necessary, and long overdue probably." Gabrielle nodded. "I accept your apology." Eleanor relaxed slightly, relief evident in her posture. But Gabrielle wasn't finished. "I hope you understand something, though," Gabrielle continued, her voice kind but firm. "What happened here today, it happens to people who look like me all the time. People make assumptions based on our appearance, our clothes, our skin. Most of the time, there isn't a Shaq nearby to step in, and the person being mistreated doesn't have the platform I do." Eleanor's face flushed, but she nodded slowly. "I understand. Or at least I'm trying to." "That's all any of us can do," Gabrielle said. "Try to do better once we know better." Eleanor stood, aware that her time was up. "Thank you for your grace, Ms. Union. I didn't deserve it, but I appreciate it." As Eleanor turned to walk back to her seat, a smattering of soft applause broke out. It wasn't mocking or sarcastic. It was genuine appreciation for a moment of growth that everyone had witnessed. Even the flight attendants were smiling now, the tension in the cabin finally broken. One of them caught Eleanor's eye and gave her an encouraging nod as she passed. Back in her seat, Eleanor found herself trembling slightly. She felt both exhausted and somehow lighter, as if she put down a heavy weight she hadn't realized she'd been carrying. From the front of the cabin, Shaq gave her a supple thumbs up. Eleanor returned it with a small, still embarrassed smile. The rest of the flight wouldn't be comfortable. Eleanor knew she'd be remembered as that woman by everyone on board, but she had, at least, changed the ending of the story. The captain's voice crackled over the speakers as the plane began its descent into JFK. Ladies and gentlemen, we're beginning our final approach into New York. Flight attendants, please prepare the cabin for landing. Passengers straightened their seats, put away tray tables, and gathered belongings. The usual pre-landing shuffle created a sense of normalcy, but this flight was anything but normal now. Word of what had happened in first class had traveled through the plane. Flight attendants from economy had found excuses to peek into first class, hoping to catch a glimpse of Shaq and Gabrielle. As the plane touched down with a gentle bump and the familiar screech of tires, Gabrielle caught Eleanor glancing back at her. The wealthy woman quickly looked away, still embarrassed despite her apology. Some lessons stick with you long after the words fade. When the seatbelt sign dinged off, no one rushed to stand. Instead, all eyes turned to Shaq, who unfolded his massive frame from his seat with careful movements. He caught Gabrielle's eye and grinned. "Hey Gabby, you got a ride from the airport?" He called out over the heads of the other passengers. "My driver should be waiting," she replied with a smile. Shaq nodded. "I'll walk out with you. Been too long since we caught up properly." The other first-class passengers watched this exchange with undisguised interest. A young man in a business suit looked like he wanted to ask for a selfie but thought better of it. An older woman whispered to her husband, "See, I told you it was her." Elena gathered her things quietly, careful not to make eye contact with anyone. The confident, demanding woman who had boarded in LA seemed to have vanished, replaced by someone who just wanted to disappear. As passengers began to file off the plane, a flight attendant leaned toward Gabrielle. "Ms. Union, you might want to know there are photographers at the gate. Someone must have tipped them off." Gabrielle sighed but nodded her thanks. "It's fine. Not the first time, won't be the last." Shaq overheard this exchange. "Stick with me, Gabby. They'll be so busy trying to get all of me in the frame, they won't even notice you." He laughed, his deep voice filling the cabin one last time. Sure enough, when they stepped into the terminal, camera flashes erupted. At least a dozen photographers and a few people with cell phones held high were waiting. Shaq put a protective arm around Gabrielle's shoulders, making her look even smaller beside his towering height. "Gabrielle, Shaq. Over here," the photographers called out. A few steps behind them, Eleanor emerged from the jetway and froze at the sight of the media frenzy. Her face paled when a photographer pointed in her direction. "That's her. The woman who caused the scene." Eleanor hurried past, head down, as several camera flashes followed her. Her carefully maintained public image was about to take a serious hit. By the next morning, the story was everywhere. Someone had captured video of part of the confrontation, and it had gone viral overnight. Entertainment news shows ran headlines like, "Gabrielle Union shamed for casual attire in first class," and "Shaq steps in. Basketball legend defends actress on flight." On social media, the hashtag first class is show your act was trending. People shared their own stories of being judged by their appearance or having assumptions made about them based on how they dressed. Elena's name and photo were quickly identified by internet sleuths. Her social media accounts were flooded with critical comments. The charity organization where she served as a board member released a statement expressing concern and announcing that they would be reviewing board conduct policies. 3 days after the flight, Gabrielle appeared on a popular morning talk show. The host immediately brought up the incident. "So, I hear you had quite an interesting flight experience recently," she said with a knowing smile. Gabrielle nodded. "It was certainly memorable." "Were you upset by how you were treated?" the host pressed. Gabrielle thought for a moment before answering. "You know, at first I was. It's never pleasant to be judged, especially so publicly. But what I've been thinking about more is how often this happens to people who don't have the platform I do." She continued, "Every day, people are judged based on what they wear, how they look, the color of their skin. Most of them don't have a Shaquille O'Neal to stand up for them, and they don't get the chance to see the person who judged them have a change of heart. The audience applauded. "And what about the woman who confronted you? Have you heard from her since?" the host asked. "Actually, yes," Gabrielle revealed. "She sent flowers to my agent's office with a note. It was a genuine apology, not just for what happened on the plane, but for a lifetime of similar behavior she's now recognizing. That takes courage." Across town, in her Upper East Side apartment, Elena watched the interview with tears in her eyes. The past few days had been a humbling experience. Friends had distanced themselves. Her phone had been ringing constantly with calls from people who'd seen the story. Her assistant had quit. But watching Gabrielle speak about her with such grace, Elena felt something she hadn't experienced in a long time, a genuine desire to be better, to do better. She picked up her phone and made a call. "Hello, I'd like to make a donation to the Dress for Success charity. Yes, anonymous please. And I'd also like to volunteer my time, if that's possible." Sometimes, a lesson learned in the most public and painful way becomes the one that truly changes a life.